I have an interest in history. I've studied history a lot. I even teach history from time to time. Tonight is one of the times. And history has laws, just like science has laws. There are laws of physics, there are laws of thermodynamics, there are laws of history as well. And the laws of history can but very rarely be abrogated. And the Jewish people have defied one of the laws of history. There was a famous Harvard University study undertaken in the 1920s that was widely circulated at the time, in which they projected the future of Jewish life in America. Jews were quite visible in America in the 1920s because large numbers, and we'll talk about that shortly, had come to America in the previous 2 or 3 decades, and they were predominantly new immigrants from Eastern Europe, and their English was not good, and therefore Harvard University undertook a study what will happen to all of these Jews, and drawing on the best evidence available, they projected that by the end of the century the Orthodox Judaism in America would completely disappear. It would be just a relic of the past. And Jews, and especially Orthodox Jews, have been defying the skeptics for a long, long time, and the same is true in our own days as well. In a more scholarly context, not the scholarship of the sociology department at Harvard University, but the scholarship of Jewish eminence, Rav Yaakov Emden, one of the great brilliant, somewhat controversial thinkers and personalities in the Jewish world, he comments there about the miracle of Jewish survival. And he says that the most remarkable, most extraordinary miracle that our people can identify, if we review the Tanakh and we recall the miracles that are described in the Torah and in other books of the revealed literature, and even if we consider the Talmudic literature as well, and we consider the Midrashic literature, he says the greatest miracle of all is the survival of the Jewish people. The fact that we're still here, the fact that we still exist. Whenever I contemplate Jewish history, and it has to be recognize that Jewish history is blighted with tragedy, with expulsion, with pogrom, with persecution, but above all of that, beyond all of that, the fact that we're still here, the survival of the Jewish people, is itself most extraordinary. And we're going to talk today about the revival of the Orthodox world, especially in the decades following the Holocaust. But I want to just end my introduction by saying we must be wary of triumphalism, saying that, we've now got it aced, and now forevermore Orthodoxy is on the rise, and for whatever reasons we may consider, some of which we'll mention, we don't know what the future will bring. And certainly any thought of triumphalism, some have decried what they call Jewish Darwinism, survival of the frummest. The notion that only those who are very religious can survive, and the others will simply assimilate or somehow melt away. And this is the polarization that many have commented upon, and many have regretted, myself included, because I don't think the polarization is something to be celebrated. I think it itself is a tragedy, the loss of the middle ground of the Jewish people. But nevertheless, what I want to look to explore tonight together is the remarkable revival of the Jewish world, and especially the world of Torah study in the years after the Holocaust. So let's now try to put it in some perspective. If we look at number 2, so there's a pattern of Jewish history, and the pattern is one of migration. If one considers the globe, and we recognize that Jewish history began in the land of Israel, which is not exactly so. One could say it began in Mesopotamia with Avram Avinu, and he made his way to Eretz Israel, but only briefly, and then the Jewish gestation, we would say, is in Egypt. And then we left Egypt and we made our way finally to Eretz Israel, and from there Jewish history continued to unfold, as we all know. So the Jewish people were exiled first to Bavel, to Babylonia, and where they stayed for a long, long time. Even those who returned to the land of Israel when the second temple was built, you probably know they were only a minority. The reason they were only a minority baffled and frustrated even the prophets at the time, who couldn't understand why the Jewish people, for the most part, have chosen to remain in Bavel. But that was the case. And they stayed in Bavel for maybe 1,000 years, actually for much longer. But until approximately the year 1000, the Jewish life was centered in the eastern lands, in what is today Iran and Iraq, Paras, Umadai, Bavel. But over time, especially after the Churban Bayis Sheni, when the Romans sacked the temple and carried off large numbers, enormous numbers of slaves, who they then sold throughout the Roman Empire. In fact, we have a record of a Roman historians who said that the slave traders were complaining that the Jewish slaves were a glut on the market and were devaluing their merchandise because there were so many of them. So many of those Jewish slaves were, no doubt many were lost to Jewish history, but there were those who were ransomed by their fellow Jews and actually created the embryonic communities in the Mediterranean lands. But those numbers were relatively small and certainly religiously weak and without strong leadership. But over time, around the year 1000, if you just want to remember as a thumbnail sketch, the Jews began, and Jewish life began to shift from the east to the west, to the Mediterranean lands, to southern Europe, to North Africa, and then from there to northern and eastern Europe. That was, for those who are keeping track, in the mid-14th century is when the large migration of Jews began to move from Western Europe or Central Europe to the east and to the north, to Russia, to Lithuania, to Ukraine, and that area. And the reason for that was primarily because of the Black Death in the mid-14th century. So because of the extreme privation and poverty and famine, so many Jews migrated and moved in at that time. And of course, as is very well known, from Spain they went mostly to the Ottoman Empire, elsewhere as well, and the Jews went later on from east to west in large numbers, especially to the USA. So that Jewish history is one series of migrations, occasionally by choice, frequently not by choice. Nothing stays the same. The travels and the sojourns of the Jewish people have always been according to the Word of God. And in a way, this coming week's parsha, not Pinchas, but the following week, is a metaphor for all of the future of Jewish history. What am I referring to, for those who are still with us? Which parsha did we read after Pinchas? Matos and Maseh. Maseh is the travels. Eila Maseh b'nei Yisrael, these are the travels. And the Torah enumerates a large number, a long list of places where they encamp, most of which are not that meaningful to us. But there's a symbolism to it. The symbolism is, it is, as I said, a paradigm. It's like a harbinger. It foreshadows the future of Jewish history, in which the Jewish people have been migrating from place to place. Often we don't know why we're going, we don't know where we're going, but ultimately it's Al Pi Hashem Yisa'u Val Pi Hashem Yachanu. World Jewry has not recovered its population since the Holocaust. If we speak about how many Jews there are today, we have not yet recovered our numbers from before the Holocaust. I have here some statistics. Now, obviously, these are all estimates. One cannot be certain with any degree of confidence about the accuracy of these figures. However, they are based on the very best information available. And a lot of research has been done, and many have written about the subject over the years. And this comes from the American Jewish Yearbook 2012, written by, and the article is written by Sergio Della Pergola. Despite his somewhat exotic name, he is the leading demographer in the Jewish world today. And these are his figures. In 1850, we're talking about world Jewry, global. In 1850, we estimate about 4,750,000 Jews, 4.75 Jews in 1850. By 1900, with intense persecution and suffering, where Jewish life was a misery in many, many places, where the poverty and the famine in the main centers of Jewish life in Eastern Europe was almost overwhelming, Jewish numbers increased from 4.75 to 10.6 million in the year 1900. In 1939, on the eve of the Holocaust, there were 16.7 million Jews in the world. Now, by the way, the reason for the increase from 1850 to 1900, which I said, despite the persecution, all of that, the numbers, the population in Europe increased dramatically as well, because it was a time of advancement, industrial revolution, and many other advances as well. So it's not just because the Jews, were blessed with extraordinary growth, but the fact is that they were, because the European population did not double in that way. The Jewish population did, and more so. In 1939, 16.7 million Jews on the eve of the Holocaust. In 1945, for reasons which we don't need to repeat, obvious, the numbers of Jews in the world dropped to 11 million. So in 1945, after the horrors of the Holocaust, 11 million Jews. Between 1945 and 2012, in 67 years of peace and prosperity, in which institutional anti-Semitism is definitely much diminished compared to any other time in all of the history of the Jewish people, the numbers increased from 11 million to 13.75 million. And we have not yet come close to replacing the numbers in the Jewish world from 1939. I want to just share with you, and maybe this is the punchline of our discussion tonight, some vignettes. In the 1950s, an American Jewish sociologist visited Britain, and afterwards he wrote a book called Under Strange Skies. What he relates there is quite well known, so I'll be quick with it, but it's a great story. He describes how he visited Gateshead, and in the Gateshead, the town of Gateshead, he made his way to the yeshiva. And although he was a Jewish man, he was, as I said, a sociologist, not religious, but he was impressed with what he saw in the Gateshead Yeshiva. And he said, he writes how I saw in the, he says Yorkshire, which I was corrected, the Gateshead is not Yorkshire, but that's what he wrote. What do you expect of an American? He said that when the Yorkshire accents, I saw the young men swaying over the Talmud and arguing about the teachings of Rabbi Akiva and Rabban Gamliel. And from there, I got in the taxi and I went to see Hadrian's Wall. I went to see the wall that Hadrian built to keep out the Scots. And it's a crumbling edifice, as interesting for tourists to see. And the taxi driver told me, here, this is the wall. I got out and looked at it, and I thought to myself, this is the same Hadrian who persecuted the sages, who had Rabbi Akiva flayed alive. And look what's left of Hadrian. If it weren't for English heritage, it'd be nothing left at all. They're preserving it on his behalf. And Hadrian is remembered as in the history books, but Rabbi Akiva lives because he is on the lips of those yeshiva students in Gateshead. This was in the 1950s. Also in the 1950s, possibly even before that, because Rav Yitzchak Meir Blach, Yitzchak Lei Blach, it says M, it should be an L. Yitzchak Lei Blach was one of the survivors of the massacre of Tels. Tels was a small but important town in Lithuania, and there was a great yeshiva there. And the Nazis massacred them all, and only 11 survived. And of those 11, they came to America, and Rav Yitzchak Lei Blach was determined to rebuild the yeshiva. And he went in, which exists today in Cleveland, also in Chicago, also in New York, and he went into a Svarim shop in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And he asked the proprietor, he said, Reb Yid, I would like to buy K'tzos HaChoshen. So the man looked at him and he said, K'tzos HaChoshen? You want to buy K'tzos HaChoshen? He said, yes, do you have one? He said, Rebbe, you want to buy K'tzos HaChoshen in America? He said, yes, I would like to buy K'tzos HaChoshen. We're starting the yeshiva. We need a base medrash. We need Svarim. He said, nobody in America has asked me for K'tzos HaChoshen in 40 years. He said, let me see if I've got one. Anyway, he goes to the back. He comes back in 10 minutes, blowing dust off of his Beckish or whatever it was, and he finds a dusty volume. He said, I had to climb up to the top. He said, I never thought I would even have another look at this book. He said, Yitzchak Leib, he said, you have bought the last K'tzos HaChoshen in America. Well, K'tzos HaChoshen is such an important book that it is in the library of every yeshiva bachar, and every bar mitzvah boy, in certain circles gets one as a present, and it's been reprinted again and again in Israel, in America, and elsewhere. But at that time, he said, K'tzos HaChoshen in America, who wants that? He said, I sell a few Sidurim, a few Machzorim, a few Chumashim, a few Haggadahs. Katzos HaChoshen in America? The Baba Rebbe came to London also after the war. He had given up on Hasidus. He shaved his beard. He had not given up on Yiddishkeit in any way. For himself, he was meticulous and he did not lose his faith. But he lost faith in the possibility of rebuilding a Hasidic dynasty after the war. A few Hasidim who survived came to him and said, Rebbe, maybe you've given up, but what about us? You can't give up on us, because if you've given up, then what will be with us? So they persuaded him to try to rebuild Babov. And Babov today is in Borough Park. I was there a few years ago in an enormous building, and I was there on a weekday morning, and there must have been in that building maybe 5 minyanim concurrently. I would say not less than 200 people in each minyan. On a weekday morning, I'm not talking about Shabbos or Yom Tov, on a weekday morning. Just when I was there were probably 1,000, maybe 1,500 people in the building at that time. And they were there, some who were there before me and some who were there after me as well. The growth is nearly miraculous.